Well, good evening, and welcome to Emmanuel Christian Seminary at Milligan. My name is Ron Castens, and I'm privileged to serve as the dean here at Emmanuel. And I'm thrilled that you're able to join us for the third installment of the Ross Smith Lectures in Pastoral Care. Today's earlier lectures have been outstanding, and if you were not here, I'd encourage you to watch those online when they become available. You will enjoy them, and I'm sure we'll be blessed from watching those videos. And using a previous analogy from our speaker this morning, I'm expecting this lecture to reach Return of the King status. So that's what we're kind of expecting. Before introducing our speaker this evening, I'd like us to once again thank Dr. Calvin and Nancy Ross, who have generously provided these lectures as a way to honor their parents. But in addition, they have honored us, and they have honored Christ whom we serve. So let's thank the Calvin and Nancy again. Our speaker again tonight is Dr. Andrew Root, and this morning Dr. Aubrey gave a fine introduction detailing Dr. Root's degrees, faculty position at Luther Seminary, and his numerous books. This afternoon, Dr. Selby spoke of Dr. Root's impact in the church and for pastors who minister in such a critical time, and did a fine job doing that as well. So it's been left to me to share the most important of the least important things. Dr. Root is a fan of the Minnesota Vikings, who sit at the bottom of their division in the NFC. And his Minnesota Twins were just eliminated last night from the Major League Baseball playoffs. Perhaps this explains his interest in God meeting us in suffering and dark places. He is also a fan of the English Premier League, and in picking a team, he latched on to Manchester City, who is almost always winning trophies, which is the bright spot, I suppose, in his sports life. And I was thinking about this, the Minnesota Vikings and Manchester City. That's a dialectic right there, right? That's a good dialect. You should write about that. That would be good. Last evening we had a brief conversation, but I was really struck by just Dr. Root and what a normal person he is, who loves his dog, loves his kids, loves his wife, and loves Jesus and the church. And we are grateful and blessed that he is using his gifts and energy and talents to honor Christ and the church by blessing us today. So, Dr. Root.
All right, I'm not sure how to follow that introduction. I'm in tears, a little bit upset, thinking about coming from Loserville, USA, in the Twin Cities, is what we call ourselves affectionately, and to deal with our sorrow. I would make a joke about Tottenham, but I'm gonna refrain from making a joke about your team. So thank you all it's been a wonderful day, and we've been wrestling with some big why questions, is what we wrestled with in the first two lectures, and I want to continue with another why question. And this why question is why change might hurt. As we think about the church and its necessity to change, why some change might hurt. Now, we are at a very peculiar time. Those of us who have been around kind of on-the-ground church conversations for a decade or two know it wasn't that long ago that you'd be in a room like this, and it would be a divided room on whether the church needed to change, whether Protestant churches really needed to change. And there was probably a good 25, 30, 40% of people who are like, no, everything's fine. We're just got to keep doing what we're doing and we'll be okay. And other people pushing for change. We're at a very interesting moment, at least in the rooms that I'm in, that it seems like we have come to a consensus and everyone agrees there needs to be change. Except once we've come to this consensus, a strange thing has happened, and it appears no one has the energy to make the change. There's a certain kind of despair that we now all agree it needs to change, and yet there doesn't seem to be any energy for it. One way we can interpret that is it's just bad luck. I mean, here we are, we finally get to a consensus, and now when we could make a change, no one has the energy for it. But I wonder if these things aren't actually connected. So for instance, if you had tickets to your favorite concert this Christmas season, like your favorite band was coming into town, and you had really great seats, like first 10 rows, it was going to be great. You woke up the day of the concert and you had the flu, it would be very bad reasoning. You would have a certain philosophical problem if you thought to yourself, my gosh, the tickets gave me the flu. You couldn't convince anyone that that was the case. And I think we feel that way kind of logically now, that here we are at this moment to change, and now everyone doesn't have the energy to change. But I actually wonder if these things are connected, that our views of change aren't actually getting us sick. And I wonder if we don't have what the Germans call Zeitkrankheit. Now, I've made up the joke many times, philosophers' quotes, German words have tryptophan in it, and particularly at a 7 o'clock lecture, to put a German word on the screen means I'm a very brave human being. So we're just going to deal with that. But the Germans do something, first of all, Zeitkrankheit, it's not the sexiest language that ever existed, but it is a genius one, and just throwing a couple words together to make a new concept. And this is one. Zeitkrankheit is a time sickness. So these German social theorists will talk about how we may have and be in the midst of a time sickness. Now this time sickness is caused by acceleration, the continued speeding up of our lives. And I think it might be a societal or even a spiritual disease that we have. So this speeding up, this acceleration comes in 3 different forms. And the first one you know very well, and if you are old enough to remember the old Family Feud, and we were to do Family Feud here, and Survey says, you would get the first one. Some of you are too young to know that reference. We hate you, all right? Let's just know that. We hate you for being so young. But here's the first one. You all know this. The first of the acceleration is there's just been a technological acceleration. It just feels like technologically things just keep going faster and faster. We have more computing power in our pocket than they had to put men on the moon. That's pretty remarkable, and a lot more computing power than they had on the Apollo moon missions. That's pretty remarkable. And the Moore's law is that microprocessing doubles, sometimes even triples, every 3 years. And so there is just a sense of this acceleration of our technological realities. Those of us who were in those rooms back in the day, particularly in the first decade of the 21st century, who are saying, yeah, the church needs to change, usually the justification wasn't about confessions or sinfulness of the church. It was the technology has changed. And people are saying things like, have you ever heard of this thing called the internet? We really got to get on top of this, which is fairly fascinating to think about. The push to change was because the technological change was there. But to say that there's been a technological speeding up is not just to say that our gadgets have changed. It does mean our whole kind of way of life seems to be picking up. Hartmut Rosa, a German sociologist who talks a great deal about this, says this about technological acceleration. He says, technological acceleration is the intentional speeding up of the goal direction processes of transportation, communication, and production. Transportation, communication, and production just seem to keep going faster and faster. And we imagine that good transportation, good communication, good production keeps advancing and accelerating and going faster. Now, something's interesting about this. When this happens, when we see a jump ahead of transportation, communication, and production, this weird human phenomenon arises that we start really worrying about our brains. We think our brains might fry. Now, some of you, again, not to be all ageist about this, but some of us who have, aren't so young in the room, remember that there are a lot of news stories, say 2005, like 2005, there's a lot of stories about how we are all, by now, in the 2020s, supposed to have brain tumors. Do you remember this? Like 60 Minutes, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, running stories like there's supposed to be an epidemic of brain tumors. Do you remember this? The idea was that holding a cell phone to your ear was supposed to give a bunch of us brain tumors. It didn't happen. It didn't happen because, well, maybe because the science wasn't great on that, Or what happened was they didn't realize that a little company in Northern California was going to create a phone that no one would ever talk on ever again. You know, in 2007, when Apple creates the iPhone, no one ever talks on it anymore. Everyone has hurt their neck just texting on it. But that was the idea. And there's a certain sense that we worry when there's a huge jump forward here in communication, that we start to worry about our brains. And that worry about our brains frying is actually a rerun. And I find this really fascinating. That in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, when the train came about, there were all sorts of news stories and doctors and scientists saying that they did not recommend that human beings get on a train. Now get this, they were saying they're worried, these doctors were saying, that they did not know if the human brain could take going over 25 miles an hour. They said they didn't know. They had no way of knowing that if it was okay. They didn't know if your brain would turn into jello going over 25 miles an hour. Now, I am not a math major, but I'm pretty sure Mach 6 is faster than 25 miles an hour, and the brain has held up. But there's something about this that we really worry kind of existentially as we see this leap forward in transportation, communication, and production, that we worry about our brains. The other thing that's just really fascinating is that it isn't until 1883, and that feels quite late to me. And we're talking after the Civil War. It isn't until 1883 that in this country we unify our clocks. That there was just no reason to care about unifying our clocks. In other words, it didn't matter that it was a town even 30, 40 miles apart, we're on the same clock. In one town it could be 12:05. In another town it could be 12:15. And in every city, every little town, village, it was noon when the sun was at the very height of the sky. But once you get to 1883 and we unify our clocks, we get the 4 time zones. And of course, what happens is it matters that we're all on the same time. And it matters because once you have a train and you can actually go fast enough for it to matter, it really matters. Say, here it's 12:30, and in Asheville, did I do my geography right? It's the same time. It matters as you're going to move people across those spaces. Before that, it just didn't really matter. You couldn't go fast enough for it really to matter. So we see how time just impacts our lives in a certain way. Well, it also leads to a sense of what the good life is, and even what the good congregation is, or what the good kind of change would be that we need to have. And it leads us into this sense of what will really count is inside this technological acceleration, the kind of change that will be quote-unquote good change is to provide more and more availability. I mean, you can even think with a train to allow more and more space to be available. The more and more availability we have, the better we have. So the kind of change we need is to help the church have more and more available to it. The problem with this is it starts to create a great deal of guilt. I don't know if this is true with you, but it's definitely true with me, that as more and more is available to me, I feel guilty for not having enough time to use it all. I mean, all of you right now have available to you, well, almost every song ever recorded, if you wanted to listen to it. And if you paid for the service, you could listen to it. We have just thousands, hundreds of thousands of movies we could watch. You could all read some of the greatest Russian literature there is right now. It's all available to you, and yet most of us don't have time to use it. Now, in my family, we've decided to use Apple has a bundling service called Apple One, which puts all their streaming services together. And you pay one low price for it, which is actually quite a high price that they just keep raising $2 every 6 months and acting like they're doing you a favor. And so we have Apple One, and I'm just confessing to you, Apple has its hand so deep in my pocket, you have no idea. And but I find myself often doing a family audit around our kitchen table, because this is what you get with Apple One. First of all, you get Apple Music, which is almost literally every song ever recorded. You get Apple TV Plus, of course, so you get all their shows. You get Apple Arcade, which, there's all their video games and things like that. But then, of course, you get sophisticated stuff like you get Apple News, which is access to 100 different newspapers from across the globe and 50 magazines. And then, of course, you get their cloud service, and on top of that, of course, you get Apple Fitness, which is now availability to 50 of the greatest workout people that are around. I don't know what they're really called. People who work out in front of you. I don't know. These people, they're there. But I find myself sitting down with my kids and Cara and being like, okay, Who's using any of this stuff? Like, is anyone using Apple Arcade? Please, just someone use it once in a while. Like, no one is using it. Has anyone gone on to Apple News? Is anyone reading anything? Of course no one is. Is anyone using Apple Fitness? No one is. And I start to feel so guilty. We're paying for all this availability, and yet no time to use any of it. One of the epidemics we deal with, particularly as kind of middle-class people with some privilege, is we have the availability of all of this stuff. Stuff that used to cost people an incredible amount of money. To listen to all of Mozart, you used to have an incredible amount of money to have the availability of all that stuff. Now it's relatively cheap. It's all there. But who's got the time for it? You have access to all these great newspapers, but who has the time to read them all? And you can start to feel under the burden of the guilt that if you just had enough time, all this availability, you could be cashing it in to be living a quite better life. We feel this, I think, in our congregational life, too. One of the places we saw more availability, those people who are pastoring congregations, is COVID forced you to get online. All of a sudden, you start to put your service on Zoom. And look, this happened at our little church. People from Seattle and people from Phoenix started to dial on and worship with us. It was beautiful. It was wonderful. There was more availability. Well, we go back in person, and you don't want to lose those people. You'd feel quite guilty to lose the availability you won. So now, my wife, the pastor, and so many pastors I know, are trying to do an in-person service and also run a Zoom service at the same time, being IT person while getting this going, and it starts to burn you out. Burning you out, trying to ride the bucking bronco of all this availability you have. So this first acceleration is just the acceleration of the technological. Now, we usually stop there, but there are more accelerations at play here. And the second one is we just see acceleration of our social lives. Now, if it's true that we've seen an acceleration of production, communication, transportation, well, there's no way to really live a human life outside of production, transportation, and communication. So if those things speed up, then our social lives are going to speed up, and particularly our kind of moral imagination speed up. Our moral norms of what it means to live well, of what it means to talk appropriately, those things all really start speeding up and going faster and faster as well. We're in a time where we've seen a great deal of change in even how we think about how we imagine our moral lives together and what it means to imagine those. And you can start to feel old really quite quickly. So one way to think about this is to think about it in the relation of a decay rate. So some of these social theorists will talk about the decay rate in this kind of perspective is the amount of time it takes something to no longer be of the present. The amount of time, which tends to be a relative time, depending on what we're talking about phenomenologically, that it's no longer of the present. So there is a certain epidemic of being a modern person, particularly a late modern person, and I don't know if this is true with you. It's very true with me. I am rarely where my body is. Like, I am always somewhere else. Like, even up here talking with you, I'm kind of already thinking, okay, my flight is at 6 a.m. tomorrow, so I'm going to get to the airport at this time, and okay, what do I got to get done tomorrow? What am I going to do on the plane? How am I going to, I need to get this work done while I'm on the plane, I need to get that work done. Okay, what's happening the weekend? I'm 3-4 days ahead. It's one of the epidemics, I think, of being a late modern person. We rarely can just be in a place. We're always projecting ourselves into some kind of future. And as we engage in that, we do have this sense that the way we kind of live our lives, it has a shorter, the present feels like it becomes shorter and shorter in many ways. And certain phenomena we experience feel like they have a shorter and shorter moment of being in the now. And that's what these theorists mean by a decay rate. So to get your mind around this, just step back with me and think of kind of technological realities. And like, how long does it take your computer to no longer be of the present? 3 years. If your computer is over 3 years old, it is an old computer. Apple, again, will not fix your computer if it's 3 years old. If you bring your computer in, I mean, they'll make you pay for it. They'll fix it. They'll make you pay for it. But if you go in with a warranty and like, I paid Apple Care, will you fix my computer? They'll look at you and say, this is 3 years old. Get a new computer, Grandpa. Like, you know, like this is a very old computer. How long does it take your cell phone to be old? 2 years. 2 years, you have an old cell phone. If you have a cell phone that's 4 years old, you are dealing with a very old phone that is no longer of the present. So right before the pandemic, I was in a university town, and I happened to be in this like very hip coffee shop that was, you know, on purpose, very industrial with a hard cement floor, and the roof wasn't, it was just the pipe showing. And it was very, very good coffee, very crowded place. You couldn't find a table anywhere. The chatter was just very loud. People were, really liked the place. I luckily got a table pretty close to the barista. It was the only table there, and luckily I got a spot to sit. Well, this young woman comes in, and I had the perfect view of this from where I was sitting, and she had a stack of books, and on the top of it was her computer. And she ordered her coffee, and it was made, and they called her name. Sure, they spelled her name wrong on the cup, because that's the barista. That's what they just do. It's an internal kind of cabal of misspelling your name. And she goes up to the front to get it. She grabs her coffee there. She's looking for a spot to sit down. There's nowhere to sit, and I can see this happening. The computer on the top of the books is starting to slide. And she has no hands free to help with this. I'm too far away to help her, and it's sliding, and it slides through kind of the top and down. She tries to catch it in her lap. It slides down, and it hits that cement floor so hard, and just went boom. And everyone just did the gasp. And all of a sudden, this very loud coffee shop is just completely quiet, and they're looking at her. And I had so much respect for her because she just kept her cool. She should be a surgeon or something, because she just put down her coffee, she looked at the room, and she said, "Don't worry, everyone. Don't worry. It's just an old computer." And everyone seemed okay with that. They're like, "Oh, okay, we won't feel bad for you." And I looked at the computer, and it wasn't an Apple II or something. It was, it was maybe 5 or 6 years old, but that was fine. We didn't have to feel as bad for it, because that was a computer that was no longer of the present. So this sense of a decay rate. Now, I tell you all that to think about kind of our moral codes, how we talk, the way we think it's appropriate to behave socially or even to talk socially. And we've seen this kind of sense of an acceleration where we've had a decay rate in our social norms. So to get into this, you all know this show, right? The Office. First of all, The Office is just interesting in its own right, because The Office is a show that they discovered. There's an article in the New York Times you can read that it was the first sign that Netflix had a problem, because when Peacock came about, the NBC streaming service, they let every other streaming service know that they were going to take back their own properties. So any NBC show was going to eventually go to this new NBC streaming service. And it was a big deal for Netflix, because something crazy, you can find the numbers, I'm making up the numbers, but they're close to this, that something like 30% of all Netflix streams were of The Office. And what was even more interesting is a huge percentage of those 30% of streams were all people under 25 years old. And they discovered it was a very common young adult practice to put The Office on in the background. So when you're doing anything else, you always have The Office on. One of a very famous young adults who was doing this is the pop star Billie Eilish. I don't know if you know Billie Eilish. I said in the last lecture, I was really seeking to be cool. And I feel very cool putting Billie Eilish up on the screen. So thank you very much. I can feel your radiations of coolness towards me. I appreciate it. But Billie Eilish, if you know her first album, that was her Grammy-winning album, there's little clips of The Office in it. There's these, between songs, you'll hear Michael Scott talk or whatever. So when she won, people were like, well, what's with this? Why is there bits of The Office in your album? And she said, well, the reason is because when we recorded the album, The Office was just on the background all the time. And then she says, as a matter of fact, The Office is always on. I'm just listening to it all the time. And I go, why? She's like, well, for me, it's just therapy. I find it really soothing just to have The Office on. And then she said this that made me die a little bit on the inside. She said, it just feels like a lost world that I feel nostalgic for. It's like, my gosh. I remember when new episodes were on. That wasn't that long ago. That was just the other day. But it senses it's no longer the present, and there's some kind of nostalgia to live within it. Well, they asked Steve Carell if he would ever be part of a reboot of The Office. So Steve Carell played Michael Scott, and he said he wouldn't, that he wouldn't be part of a reboot. And it's really fascinating why he said he wouldn't. The real reason he wouldn't is because he's a big movie star now. He doesn't need to be. He doesn't need to do this character. But what he said is fascinating. He said he would not be part of a reboot because he just doesn't think Michael Scott's jokes are appropriate anymore. Now, if you've watched The Office, I guarantee you, if you watch more than 2 episodes, first of all, you will laugh really, really hard. And then you will say to yourself as you're laughing, I don't think you can say that anymore. I don't think you can say that joke anymore. And some of those episodes were not that long ago. And yet they no longer, as a kind of engine for humor, those jokes are not appropriate anymore. They're okay still in a kind of syndication as shows from back at another time, but they are no longer appropriate. They would be eviscerated on social media if they tried to air those today. That's very fascinating. That has happened incredibly quickly, some of these changes. Now, one of the real pinch points on being a pastor in a congregation at this time, especially over these last 8-10 years, is you're dealing in a congregation with people who are at different speeds in this social change. And how you negotiate that is very difficult. And it just happens. It doesn't have to happen this way, but it has happened this way in the last 5-6 years, that it breaks down generationally. So you have a lot of younger people who have very different social norms telling older people that they are no longer of the present. Nothing makes you feel more angry than being told you're no longer of the present. And you can see how it starts to build these tensions. Now, if you're running a brand or a business or something, you just can get all people who think the exact same way. In a congregation, it's much harder to do that, and actually probably a theological problem to do that. But it becomes an incredible stress for the pastor of how do you negotiate this acceleration of social norms and keep people together in the midst of all this. So it leads us to think that the kind of change we need is more and more accessibility. And that accessibility becomes the most important thing. But one of the issues with accessibility, and this builds off a Korean philosopher named Byung-Chul Han, who he talks about how those of us who have lived in this digital age, we become obsessed with the smooth. We like everything smooth. And he goes into talking about Jeff Koons sculptures, you know, Jeff Koons sculptures. You all know these. He has a very famous one at the Getty in LA. It's this huge balloon animal, this huge balloon dog that's sold for $10 million. This huge, it's all glass, and there's no sharp edges to it. It's all a smooth surface, and you can see your own reflection in it. And Han thinks it's utterly disgusting because it's just a sense of smoothness where you just see a reflection of yourself. And he says we're the same way with our phones. It's just a smooth space, and we want everything smooth in this world, that we've become just enemies of anything that's negative or difficult. And this becomes part of the issue with the acceleration, is we need everything smooth, everything accessible, because we need to go faster and faster. We need to continue to have more and more gains. But we do lose a sense of otherness in the midst of this. Even otherness who are at different political positions, who have different views of what it might be good. But it becomes very fraught and very filled with tension in these moments. Well, that leads us to our third form of acceleration, and that is just the acceleration of the pace of our lives. Now, it just feels like, I mean, if this isn't you, I would like to meet you and shake your hand. But for, I think, everyone in this room, it just feels like our day-to-day lives just get busier and busier and more filled with stuff. But it shouldn't be that way. I mean, in some sense, if you have acceleration in technological advance, acceleration in social life. If we have all these time-saving breakthroughs, and we even have a sense that we have more quote-unquote freedom just to express our own identities, we should feel like the pace of our lives is kind of slowed down. You know, we should just feel like we have more time. But of course we don't. We feel like our lives just keep getting busier and busier and busier. And yet there are all these time-saving technological breakthroughs. Like email is just a really good example of it because we deal with it so directly. But email is interesting to think about. You know, there could be an alternate universe where in every major city across the globe there is a statue to an email browser. I mean, we could have a story of, as human beings, that email changed our life, that it made everything remarkably better across human life. So for instance, think about it this way. What I mean in this alternate universe is, let's say you had a job 30 years ago, say in 1990 or something. You had a job where it was, you had to write 10 letters a day. You had to do 10 correspondence. How long would it take you to do 10 letters? Maybe 2 hours? I mean, you have to write the letter, dictate it, get it printed out on company letterhead, find the address, of course, sign it, address the envelope, get a stamp on it, get it out to post. Maybe it would take you 2 hours to do to do 10 correspondence. Well, then this thing comes around called electric mail. How long should it take you to do 10 emails? If you're going slow, it should take you half an hour to do 10 emails. There it is. Since 1995, across the world, we've all had an extra hour and a half in our lives. Since 1995, we all have been eating right. We've been exercising. We have whole generations of young people whose parents took them on long walks in the woods. They're so well adjusted. There was so much time. We read to them for that hour and a half. Like since 1995, we had an extra hour and a half in our lives. Of course, this is a complete alternate universe. It doesn't work this way. Because what email does is it creates the conditions not for you to be able to do 10 correspondence in a half hour. That's not really its breakthrough. Its breakthrough now is it creates the conditions for you to receive 40 or 50 or 60 emails a day. It creates the possibility for you to have a lot more work to do. So what it provides is an opportunity inside your unit of time for you to do more actions. So no wonder we feel busy, because now we realize, my gosh, I have to respond to, in 2 hours, I have to respond to 60 emails. How am I going to do that? Well, the only way I can do it is I can't keep my 2-hour time of correspondence. So I have to take my computer, my tablet, or my phone to my daughter's swim meet. And what I'll do is when she's swimming, I'll watch her. But when any of those other kids are swimming, they can drown in the pool. I'll do email. You know what I mean? Like, that's what I'm going to do. And then you realize after her 8-year career of swimming, you realize you were never really at one of her swim meets. You know, you watched her swim each length of the pool she swam, but you were never really there because you were out there multitasking, because you couldn't do enough of these actions inside a unit of time. So email becomes insidious. It doesn't free you and give you more time. It just makes it so you can do more and more and more and more. And social media is even more so. Now with one tweet, with one post on Instagram, just think about how many actions and conversations that creates. So it starts to make us feel incredibly busy, like our lives are just incredibly full and incredibly busy. But it tells us that the best kind of action is just more and more attainability. If we can attain more and more and more, and you start to see how this can become exhausting. And what it ultimately creates is this reality where this kind of acceleration and doing more and more and more starts to lead us to feel quite alienated. That you can, like your daughter's swim meets, you feel like you were alienated from actually experiencing them, like you were never really there. And this can start to happen in just our day-to-day lives. We start to feel alienated from our very lives. To make this point, let me turn you to one of the greatest, most sophisticated outputs and philosophers we have in our world, The Onion. You know The Onion? The spoof website. So here's a story, and you know the great thing about The Onion is first of all, the pictures are just great. But one of the great things about The Onion is they take really stupid things and then act like they're news stories. So here's a news story for you. Man on the cusp of having fun suddenly remembers every single one of his responsibilities, all right? So I'm going to have this story read to you, so sit back and listen to this story. And I think it's very funny. And it's a bit dated. You'll see that it's probably about 6-7 years old. But it's very funny, but it also makes a really important point, I think. So here it is. Listen to it.
According to sources, Platt tried to put his responsibility-laden thoughts out of his mind and loosen up by opening another beer, but suddenly remembered a magazine subscription that needed to be renewed by Friday, a medical bill he thought might now be overdue, and the fact that he needed to do laundry by tonight or he would run out of clean socks and underwear. "Who made this guac?" said the man, who almost left himself to take pleasure in the beautiful evening with his closest friends before he let his brain become consumed with thoughts about how he needs to move on from his current job, but is putting off the work necessary to make the transition. It's delicious. While the barbecue's host chatted with Platt about how excited he was to see the upcoming Superman movie, sources confirmed that all Platt could think about was the fact that his recently married sister was coming to town next weekend and was supposed to stay with him, which reminded him that he needed to clean his apartment, which reminded him that he needed to buy extra bedding for his sister to sleep on, which reminded him that he needed to make an after-work trip to Bed Bath & Beyond, which reminded him that he would be tired after work and wouldn't want to go to Bed Bath & Beyond, which reminded him that he also needed to go to the grocery store because his sister would think he's irresponsible if she saw his empty refrigerator, which reminded him that he and his sister aren't as close as he'd like, which reminded him that his parents already had a house and 2 cars by the time they were his age, which reminded him that he's been with his girlfriend for over 5 years and that while everything was going fairly well, he felt overwhelmed by the prospect of marriage and the mounting pressure to propose. "Yeah, Man of Steel looks good," said a smiling Platt, who was only thinking about how he graduated from college over 10 years ago and still owed $86,000 in student loans. "Can't wait to see it." Accounts confirmed the man nearly convinced himself that all of his responsibilities would be taken care of in due time, and that he should just relax when a friend mentioned a recent road trip he had taken with his wife, which prompted Platt to mull over the fact that he still needed to renegotiate the lease terms of his 2010 Jetta, a task he was delaying until he had a fender bender repaired. In addition, Platt began thinking about the number of open envelopes on his kitchen table, some of the contents of which he remembered were actually important and should be rechecked before he throws them away. "Hey, I have to get going," said the man, who could barely recall anything that anyone at the gathering had said the entire evening. "Just a couple of things I need to get done tonight. This was great, though," he added.
All right. Very funny. Also points to a spiritual epidemic. That it is very hard for people sitting in your church on Sunday in worship to be there, to have that experience. That you very easily, in the midst of all of these things pulling at you to do, can be very hard to feel even alive, like you're living your life, that you're always kind of trying to think about how you have to get all of these things done, how you're managing everything going on here. I mean, this is a context where a lot of people come into our churches, a lot of people that we do ministry with, that they just feel a deep sense of alienation from their own lives. And it makes sense. I mean, this happens at an institutional level too, that one of the ways we think even about what makes for an institution to be stable, and this is a point Hartmut Rosa makes, I think, very convincingly, is that all modern institutions, the way they stabilize themselves is dynamically. So in other words, what stabilizes an institution is growth. The only thing that a modern institution has to secure its future is that it is a growing institution. And so this is what he means by dynamic stabilization, is that what stabilizes an institution is it keeps growing. So how does a politician run for office? It says, "I will grow our economy." That how does a business stay open? Well, a business needs to be growing at 15, 18%. And if it's not growing, and if it's only growing minimally, say it's growing 2, 3, 4%, you should sell your business for parts. There's no reason to keep going. The idea is that it's only stable if it continues to grow. And his point is it's very insidious. Because let's say something happens like, well, we'll just keep it in the realm of your business. Let's say that your business, or maybe your church, grows 30% next year. However you want to think of that growth. Growth in members, growth in budget, grows 30%. The way dynamic stabilization works is you can't say, my gosh, we grew 30% this year. You know what, next year, let's only grow at 5%. We'll still be, after 2 years, 25% up. Doesn't work that way. If you grew 30% last year, you need to grow 31 next year. And then you're going to need to grow past that the next year, and past that the next year, and past that the next year. So his point is we live in a time where everything, its justification is its continued growth, and that you have to continue to serve this engine of more and more growth. And one of the huge questions we have that he's particularly looking at is what's the speed limit? How much faster can you push things? For instance, can you push the environment to continue to speed up? Can you push democratic discourse to go faster and faster? Can you push mental health and just keep pushing people to go faster and faster? He calls this, can you push economic systems and allow them to not become imbalanced with inequity? That he calls this destabilization, that we find in this dynamic stabilization, we find these desynchronized moments. And I wonder how congregational life functions within that. We tend to think that the best church is a church that's continuing to serve this dynamic stabilization, continuing to grow, that what will stabilize it is that it will grow in some kind of resources more and more. But that's an insidious master to have to follow, to continue to push towards that dynamic stabilization. To give you a picture of this, one of the ways these theorists talk about this is that there's a certain equation that plays here. in the equation, to be honest, I don't speak mathematics, but this does make some sense to me, that Herman Daly, who used to run the World Bank, said it works like this. Money plus commodities equals money primed. That you invest money in commodities to make more money. And if you don't make more money, then it's a very bad investment. But we see that this also functions with modern research universities. The modern research universities work with an equation, something like knowledge plus research equals more knowledge. And if you watch any college basketball or college football, you know that each school gets a commercial between for halftime. Each half they get a commercial, and every commercial for these big universities is always this equation: K plus R equals K primed. You know, it's something like the University of Wisconsin, where a new breakthrough is around every corner. The University of Illinois, where tomorrow is happening today. The University of Florida, where research becomes breakthroughs for tomorrow. Like there's this sense of growing knowledge. And if you can't grow knowledge, then you cannot stabilize your institution. In the church, we probably have something like this. If we're not careful, we take into our imaginations M plus P equals M primed. Members plus programs equals more members. And that becomes a dynamic that we think will stabilize our church. I actually know of a church in the middle of the country that realized they had a problem. And the problem was they were not going to be able to prime their M if they couldn't solve this problem. And the problem was parking. They couldn't get people out of their parking lot fast enough. They realized their growth would be stunted if people could not get out of their parking lot within 10 minutes. Now, I don't want to belittle parking issues. You would see I get very impatient in traffic, so I understand that's a real deal. But what they decided to do is to do a capital campaign, and they raised $15 million, and they used that $15 million, it's a very big church, they used that $15 million to be able to, grease the levers of the city and pay some other things to get it so that an off-ramp could be built really close to their church. And it seemed to work. It primed the M. They grew. Very different kind of moral sense of what a good church is. Or maybe for us, it's R plus R equals R primed, like resources plus relevance equals more resources. Or maybe it works the other way, that relevance plus resources will equal more relevance. But the idea is that we have to grow this. And we have to continue to serve this growth. And if we don't, then our institution will not, our community will not have a life. This is a very different kind of change, to say to a congregation, okay, we need to change. And I go, yeah, we should change. And then it says to get on this acceleration rocket can become exhausting and can burn people out really, really quickly. So it's just possible that maybe this kind of view of change is, like I said, getting us sick. And maybe it is actually imposing in us a sense of depression. That there's a sense that the church has become depressed because of this form of action. Now, what I don't mean is that people in the church are depressed, though that's probably true for certain individuals. But I wonder as a collective if our congregations don't feel a kind of sense of depression. Now, there's a great book written by a Parisian scholar named, his name is Alan Ehrenberg, and he's written this book called The Weariness of the Self. And what it is, it's a fascinating book. If you want a good read, I would recommend it. It's a genealogy, and kind of in philosophical terms, a genealogy is kind of looking at the genes that make up our cultural moment. Like, what are the cultural realities that make up the kind of time we're in? So it's a genealogy of depression, and how depression since the 1970s has become a very common and debilitating epidemic that we deal with across the West. And he says if you look to the early part of the 20th century into the 19th century, yeah, you can find moments of melancholy and depression, but it wasn't as writ large as it is now. And so he tries to tell that story, and it's really fascinating. And the title is insightful, The Weariness of the Self, but it's really more fascinating in its original French title. And its original French title is The La Fatigue d'être soi. Now, you would one way to literally translate that is the fatigue of being yourself. That's fascinating. The fatigue of being yourself. So his bigger point is depression has become such an epidemic for us because we're exhausted. The demand on the self to curate and perform itself that once you just don't have the energy to keep going, to keep performing, to keep doing, to keep curating, to keep making yourself into an interesting project, what sets in the midst of the fatigue is just, you don't have the energy to keep doing it. And so all this movement, and we've kind of touched on this today, this movement towards performance, towards achievement, or in an interesting way, thinking about being a transition from being a should-based society. Like we used to live in should-based societies, and that could have been harsh for some of us to live in a should-based society, but we used to kind of have our moral issues be, you should obey God's command. You should do what your parents tell you. You should follow in the footsteps of your ancestors. We tend, in a broader cultural form, not to feel under the strictures of the should anymore, but we do, like I was saying earlier this afternoon, feel the guilt of living under the could. You could have been a more interesting person. You could have done more with your life. You could have been more disciplined and just finished that degree, and you could have been a better person. You could read that stuff and actually, be more interesting. You could, and people live under the tyranny of the could. And Ernberg's point is living under that burden of trying to curate and be an interesting self inside of a could society can create huge points of burnout and depression. And I actually wonder in a broader form if what we have going on with our church in our form of change isn't giving us the la fatigue d'etre aiguise, that in some sense we're too fatigued to be church. I was in a congregation not too long ago in South Dakota, beautiful church, and I walked into it, just put a couple $1 million wing on this thing, walked in, a beautiful fireside room with leather couches, a new youth room that was just spectacularly beautiful. The pastor walked me down to the area outside, the narthex outside the sanctuary. There were just posters everywhere of all these events going on. Walks me to his office. We walked down a hallway, walked past a door of associate pastor, another associate pastor, middle school minister, youth minister, college minister, music director 1, music director 2, music director 3, organist, just a huge staff. We sit down in his office, and my response is, man, this is an impressive church. This is amazing. And to the pastor's credit, he just dropped his shoulders and said, yeah. He said, yeah. I mean, it is. These are wonderful people. It's a great church. It's a wonderful call. I'm really lucky. But I got to tell you, if I had one word that I would describe our church, we're exhausted. I would call us depressed. I mean, these people, this is still South Dakota. When we need people to come on Sunday mornings, they show up. But whenever we say, hey, we're going to pull together and do this, or we're going to do that, I just get a look like, we don't have time for it. We don't have energy for it. We don't. So if I had to describe our church, he said if I had to describe the churches in our synod, I would say we're depressed, that there's a depression that's set in. Again, I wonder if our views of change just feed into this acceleration and aren't making us quite sick. So what do we do with this? I mean, well, how do we think about change? How do we think about it in a way that doesn't give us this issue? Well, here's Ernberg. I think this is an insightful quote. He says, depression appears not as a pathology of unhappiness, but more as a pathology of change. So to say we need to change, we need to be really clear on what we mean by change, what kind of change we mean, or it can get us sick. It can get us in this difficult situation. So is our form of action that brings change, is it about accelerating and doing more with less, which, by the way, is I often think why we're so addicted and have been for the last few years with the word innovation within Protestantism, because innovation is a way of trying to do more with less. And it feels like this is a moment where the church has less, so let's try to get creative and do more with less, which we shouldn't be surprised is just burning people out. So we're going to need another form of action. And it's fascinating that Hartmut Rosa, who really develops this whole theory on this acceleration, he says, he tells in his own story that he published this all, and he started to be known in the German press as the slowdown guru. That he was called the slowdown guru, both with kind of a needle, that there's the guy who's the professor from Jena who's talking about needing to slow down. He became known as the slowdown guru. But he said he started to feel very uncomfortable with the call to slow down because he thought that this acceleration was so insidious and such a big issue that slowing down wouldn't be enough. It just wouldn't work. And you know this. We all should slow down. If you have the opportunity to slow down and take a breath, you should slow down. But slowing down will not be enough. And you know it because we all have in our lives imposed slowdowns that don't seem to give us what we need. For instance, the weekend is an imposed slowdown. Most of us need a weekend from our weekends. They're just so busy and we're just exhausted with them, and it just becomes a different kind of acceleration. Or one that I know really well, and I'm sure some of you do too, is your vacation. If you had this experience on your vacation, it's great for 3 days. But at some point within day 4 or 5 of your 10-day vacation, this very dark feeling comes over you, and this is what you realize: my inbox. And you realize you've taken 5 days away from your inbox, and what's going to happen is your first 3 days back in the office after your vacation, you are going to have to work 12, 13-hour days just digging yourself out of emails. And you know, if you're a pastor, you had to do a bunch of work just to get on vacation in the first place because you had to get everything taken care of, and you're just so exhausted, you just don't know what to do. But if you have that experience with your inbox and you realize it's going to take 3 12-hour days just to do email to get out of your inbox, you start to feel like, why did I take a vacation at all? I should have never even gone on vacation. What's the point? I need a vacation from my vacation of having to get back from my vacation. You're just like, why did I do this? Or you do some terrible things like I do, and you cheat on your vacation by pulling your computer out and be like, I'm going to do an hour and a half every night. Or if you're super rich, which probably isn't us, you just bring your assistant along with you, and while you're scuba diving, they're doing your email for you. Like, those are your options in this world. It's tough. And then, of course, the eternal vacation is supposed to be retirement. And we know a lot of people within our congregations and maybe ourselves where you retire, and after 6 months you get very antsy. And after working 70 hours weeks on your business, you decide, I'm going to start another business. Like, you just can't sit still. So slowing down, we should do it. But we're going to need more than just slowing down. So Rosa said the kind of action we need is one that we know deeply within the Christian tradition. And he calls it this deep sense of resonance. And he means it's a form of action that avoids this deep reality that's occurred in acceleration, and one of the dangers we've talked about all day, this deep modern temptation to instrumentalize all of our relationships. That our relationships become for something else. But he said we still do have these experiences. These deep experiences where we feel encountered by something, that we feel like the world again speaks to us, where we feel like the kind of relationship we have with a piece of art or the piece of music or a friend in a long conversation, it isn't accelerated and time doesn't speed up, but it becomes full of something, where we feel spoken to, where it becomes the opposite of this sense of depression, where we feel like the live wire between us and the world gets severed, where we actually feel quite alive. And these kind of moments of change bring us life. Now, that feels a little bit obscure, so I need to give you a story in a film clip that maybe illustrates this. It's something I have to show you more than I can tell you. So first of all, let me tell you a story. It's about a friend of mine. He was a Presbyterian pastor in this church, and he had been in this church for about 1.5 years, and the leadership of a Presbyterian church is called the Session. And so the Session was in conflict. They actually hated each other. And he was very worried that they were going to have a new year, and he was worried someone on the Session could get murdered. Like, they just hated each other. They were in conflict. And so he's going to have a Session retreat, and he decided he needed to do something to break this conflict. So he had heard this at some pastor's event or something, so he tried it, this exercise, and he took 4 chairs and he lined them up, and then took 4 other chairs and then lined those up facing each other, so people would sit and they would be knee to knee. And on one side of the chairs, on one of the rows of chairs, he put a notepad and a pencil, and he had people sit and just look at each other. The person across from you would just spend 2 minutes and look at the face of the other person. And then after 2 minutes of doing that, the people who had the pad of paper would pick that up and spend another 2 to 3 minutes sketching the face of the person across from them. And then he would say, switch, and you would do that again with someone else. It went exactly how you would imagine it went. People felt incredibly uncomfortable. They were making faces at each other. They couldn't even look at each other. It felt really weird. But after a round of this, people kind of got into it. And it seemed to work. After doing this about 3-4 rounds, he ended the experience, and it looked like it worked. He thought, no one's going to die. There will be no murder. I think we've solved this issue. So he started to debrief it with the group. It was like, well, what was that like for you? And they said, Pastor, this was really weird. It was really, I don't know where you learned this. It was a very weird, strange thing. But it was good. It felt like, okay, now we can get into the business of the session. This is good. Except this session had two people that I think every church has within it. And the first person was Jody. And Jody at this church was about 35. She'd stumbled into the church after a job transition. She was just upbeat and positive. She was willing to volunteer for anything and everything, and always did it with a very chipper attitude. She was just great to be around. She was the kind of person who just kept the church going through a pastoral transition. She would pay out of her own pocket every year for a service they did on the beach. She was just really upbeat and willing to do stuff and did it with a positive attitude. And I think every church has a Jody. Well, every church also has a Dave. And Dave in this church was about 75, and he hated everyone and hated everything about everyone, and was very clear to tell you. He hadn't smiled in decades, and he was just grumpy, and he just was so upset with everything all the time, and he would find you in the hallway and tell you why the car you bought was stupid and how you're raising your 4-year-old is really dumb. And it was hard to be around. Everyone avoided them every time they could, but he was willing to be on any committee, so he got elected to every committee. That's how churches function. So Dave and Jody are on this committee, and so they start to debrief this experience. And they get to Dave, and they say, well, Dave, what was the experience like for you? And he says, I would agree with everyone. It was good. It was weird, but it was good. And then the whole thing changes, and he goes, except when Jody was looking at me. And then he goes off. And he goes, when Jody was looking at me, I just felt judged. I felt like she was looking through me. I felt like she was belittling me. I felt so judged by Jody. I mean, it was just awful. I just felt like she was looking down on me completely. And now everyone has no idea what to make of this. And all the goodwill that had just started is gone. And people can just feel the conflict fall upon the group. And poor Jody is just sitting there, and she's blinking as fast as she can to try to keep the tears from pouring out. And she feels blindsided, and everyone feels blindsided, and Dave's just going out. She was just so mean. I just felt like she was belittling me. And no one can even make sense of this. Like, a-hole Dave was intimidated by Jody? Like, that doesn't even make any sense. But he's just like, she was belittling me. She was looking down on me. Finally, my friend's like, Dave, thank you. Thank you. I want to thank you for your willingness to share this. But I think I'm speaking for the group when I say, we're a little confused. Well, can you help us understand what's going on here? I don't know. She would just look at me. She was judging me. She was looking at Dave, thank you. Again, thank you. But again, we're confused. Can you help us understand why you're reacting like this? And he was really quiet, and no one knew what was going to happen. Like, was he going to get out and storm out of the room? Like, what was going to happen here? And he thought for a while, and then he said, yeah. No, yeah, that's it. And then he said to the group, he said, well, before we started here today, I had told some of you that my daughter, who is about Jody's age, had just moved home with us. And some of you said, is Donna going to come to church now? And I said, no, Donna can't come to church because Donna works on Sundays. But I was lying to you all. Donna's never worked on Sundays. She's worked on Saturdays. But that doesn't matter now at all because Donna doesn't work anymore. See, the reason that she moved home with us is she started missing too many shifts and she couldn't pay for her rent. And I don't think any of you know this, but then she was just fired, and I don't think any of you know this, but Donna suffers from some really severe depression. And I guess what it is when I see Jody, I think about who Donna could be if she didn't have the depression. And everything changed. Everything changed. Dave was still Dave. He was still hard to be around. He was still not the most pleasant guy in the world, but he was a person to them now. He was someone with a deep story in a relationship that was tensed, and they felt bound to him in a different kind of way. My friend said it changed his church. It wasn't the kind of change that demanded do more, go, compete. There's a shrinking market share. How are we going to get more? It was a kind of change that brought people connected through the confession of a loss. But it bound them together as a sanctorum communal. It bound them together of walking through life with each other. Very different form of change. They resonated with each other's lives and with Dave's story. Now, to illustrate this further, I want to show you a video clip, and it comes from a stand-up set that Aziz Ansari did. I don't know if you know Aziz Ansari. He was on Parks and Rec, and he played Tom on Parks and Rec. So this is a stand-up, his stand-up show from 2019. So this is how it ends, and I got to tell you, it is the strangest ending to any comic set I have ever seen, but it's really deeply fascinating. There's a couple things you need to know as you watch this. The first thing is he'll reference his grandmother, who he talked about earlier in the show. His grandmother is on hospice and about to die. So just know that when he mentions his grandmother, that's what he means. The second thing you need to know, which is a little bit more complicated and controversial, is that Aziz Ansari had got really pulled into the Me Too movement. And you can read that and make your own decisions. It is a very complicated situation, and in no way was he innocent, but it was also very, very complicated. What it meant that's relevant to this clip is that he didn't do stand-up for years, and he didn't know if he would ever do stand-up again. And so he'll reference that, and I think that's important to know. So this is the very end of the show. All right, like I said, I've never seen a stand-up show that ends like that. But it's really powerful. And there's something informative about it for us, I think, about what it would mean to lead and to create communities that invited people to be in this moment with these people. Instead of thinking the only thing that we can do in a church is we got to keep going, we got to keep going, we got to keep going. Decline and sit in, we got to get ourselves out of this, we got to dig ourselves out of this, we got to go, we got to innovate, we got to go. And yet it could just create more and more alienation. But what would it mean to lead in a way where we create spaces for people to be in this moment with these people, and the gift that that could be. Now, to get to that, it's going to take some distinct theological realities that are in here. And it first of all starts with a confession. He starts by making confession. I used to say, good night, see you later. Never really meant it. The kind of community that can be these people in this moment will have to learn how to confess. And then he says, I saw a world where I couldn't do this. And it felt like I died. Something died in me. There is this assertion of what it means to confess our death experiences to one another. Giving them over to the community, believing that God, out of those death experiences, will knit us together and bring new life in the midst of that. And then, having experienced that kind of togetherness, that kind of community, the only response to God's justifying work in our lives is to become the people in the world who say thank you, who live in gratitude. Both Calvin and Luther thought that the core of the Christian life is to live in gratitude, to live out of our lives always saying thank you to God, always saying thank you to those in our community, always saying thank you to our neighbor. So how do we teach a community to say thank you? And you think about that leadership-wise, are you as a pastor able to say thank you to the community? And then, of course, the last element, which is really important, is how can you lead a community into a practice of silence? I mean, I've never seen a stand-up bit where he takes the whole congregation, essentially, and moves them into silence. Maybe our communities will be places of more silence. It is a really fascinating thing that in cultures where people are so busy, they tend to want to be in busy churches. It's weird. They're so busy, and yet they want a church that is so busy. And I think there has to be a way where we teach people to be still and to listen and to be attentive. But that'll take confession and gratitude and a formation of what it means to be these people in this moment, these people. I think it's a very different way of being. All right, with that, I want to say good night and thank you very much. All right. I do want to thank you. I want to end with just one more kind of anecdote that maybe pulls all of this together and to kind of leave you with. I guess it's kind of a benediction. And it's connected to this picture right here. And this is a picture that you can find in a little Anglican church on the holy island of Lindisfarne, which is in northern England in Northumbria. A year and a half ago, my family and I, my two kids, and my wife Cara, we walked St. Cuthbert's Trail, which you pick up in the borderlands of Scotland, you pick up in Melrose, and you walk at 63 miles till you get to the holy island of Lindisfarne. And you can only get across the island of Lindisfarne when the tide is out, and you have to be very clear of when that's happening, and then you walk the 3 miles across the mud flats until you reach this island. So we decided to walk it. We decided that we would walk it in summer of 2020 is when we decided we'd walk it. We made our plans. We were excited to do it. And then, of course, you guys all don't seem traumatized enough. When I said 2020, you were just supposed to start shaking and remembering those times. So, of course, it gets canceled in 2020. Lucky for us, we reschedule for 2021, and it looks good. Europe opens. If you remember, June 2021, this is going to happen. We're going to go on this walk. Well, Scotland never opens, not without a 14-day quarantine. So it gets pushed to August 2022. Well, it was really God's providence because our kids now were a rising senior and going to enter high school, 9th grade, and it became a walk of 63 miles of letting go of our kids, of letting them grow up. Our poor kids are being raised by 2 firstborn children. And our poor firstborn child being raised by 2 firstborn children, the battles for control are epic. And so this walk was this spiritual journey of letting our kids go, particularly letting our son go. But it became letting go of something else too. We were both these 2 youth group stars that were told we were supposed to change the church, and now here we are in the middle of our careers and wondering, did we do it? Every youth pastor had told us we were the future. Well, we get to the Holy Island, we cross over, as you're walking, there's 2 ways to get to the island. Without a boat, there's only 2 ways, the Pilgrim's Path through the mud flats, or there is a causeway. And you notice as soon as the causeway's open, and the causeway's only open when the water is out, that there are people streaming over. And it's a major tourist spot to go if you are just going to spend a half day. You go across, there's a castle there, there's an old abbey there. People are just streaming across. Well, we walk it, and we get to the beach, and we've done it. We have walked 63 miles, a spiritual voyage. We hug each other. We didn't know if we could do this. We've done it. And all we have to do now is walk about 300 yards to the Abbey, and we finished it. Well, as you come up the beach, you get dumped onto the kind of main road, and all the people are being poured out of their parking lots onto the road, and you meet them. And I had my Martin Luther experience, which Luther in 1515 does a pilgrimage from northern Germany into Rome, gets into Rome, and hates everyone and everything about the holy city. This is his first real sign that Rome is corrupt, because look at this city, look at what has happened here. And I have that experience. I walk up on the road and there are all these tourists going for ice cream and t-shirts, and they're in my way, and I wanted to elbow them, and I wanted to scream, "You idiots, I just walked 63 miles for Jesus, get the bleep out of my way." I was so frustrated and angry, and all this righteous indignation. Well, we get to the Abbey, we embrace, we've done it, and then we go to our hotel. We're going to spend the night on the island. And there's only about 20 rooms on the island. There's all these little hotel above pubs. That's all there is. So we go, we take a shower, we unpack our bags. Well, we come out at about 3:30, and the place has been completely transformed. It's a very different place because now the water's in. And everyone who was a tourist and was just there has got to get back over the causeway. And now you are on a haunted island with about 60 other people. So this whole place comes alive to us in a different way. Well, we walk over and look at the Abbey again, and now it's speaking. This old Abbey built in the 7th century, built by the Celtic monk Aidan in 635. We walk over to this little Anglican church for evening prayer, and some of the rocks on this church have been on top of each other since 635 when Aidan was there. We go in, we have evening prayer with the congregation, some fishermen, some other pilgrims, and then we walk the back of the church and just look at it. And this picture hangs on the back of the church wall. This picture is a list of every prior, bishop, or vicar who has overseen that little church from 635 all the way, you can't see it, it's very blurry, but to the very end, in 2018, the new vicar, Sarah Hillis, came to that congregation. 635 to 2018, and she's still the vicar there. First thing I want to end with and tell you all, the church has a long history. It has been here a long time. And I was told I was somehow supposed to save the church. I'll let go of that. The church parents me. I don't parent it. That became incredibly clear. But then if you look closely, and you won't be able to see this because this is too blurry, but you look at it, and right around the 9th century, there's about a 300-year period where there is no vicar, there is no prior, there is no bishop on this island, because word came that some strange boats were coming from the northern sea down in, and Viking raiders were coming. So the monks there grabbed Cuthbert's bones and all their holy chalices and walked northern England for 300 years until the Durham Cathedral was built. Now, what I want to leave you with is these are hard times. Those of you who are seminarians and are preparing for ministry, you are not going into the golden era of the church. These are hard times, particularly for American Protestantism. Those of us who have been in ministry for a long time, these are not easy times. But there are no Viking raiders. And I mean that quite seriously. These are tough times, but there have been far tougher. And the church has survived. And Jesus Christ has been faithful. And to see the gospel as the beautiful thing you get to give your life to really is enough. It really is. And it is an incredible privilege. And none of your teachers, none of your mentors can promise you a golden era of the church. But I think we can promise you it's going to survive. And you giving your life to it is worth it. But you're not even giving your life to the church. You're giving your life to Jesus Christ. And that will be worth it. That will be utterly beautiful. These are not the golden times, but there are not any Viking raiders. And we should avoid the catastrophizing. I can't tell you how many people I hear who say things like, if we don't get our act together, if you guys don't all start innovating and finding new creative ways to do church, there's not going to be a church in America. There's not going to be a church in America. I get it. These are hard times. And some of our denominations and some of our institutions won't survive. And I feel panicked about that when it comes to my own life. But I also have to remember, no, that's to catastrophize. The church is the very body of Jesus Christ. It will be okay. It does not need you to save it. But it does call you to be faithful, to love the people within it, and to proclaim always Christ in Him crucified. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for this day. Thank you for these people. And thank you particularly for these students and their teachers. And may you again and again renew their minds. Thank you for the Rosses and the blessings that they've provided us by giving us this opportunity to be together. And we know, God, in your grace and wisdom, that this day will bless the church, that this day will bless the world as we proclaim your life, death, and resurrection. Amen.